Hello, my name is Chad Pirotte and I work for Holy Family School of Faith. You can go to schooloffaith.com to find more information about that organization. I wanted to talk a little bit today as we are stranded at home with the quarantine because of the coronavirus about the role of the domestic church and its relationship to our children. So first of all, here's the question. What is the domestic church? That's just a simple fancy word for saying the family unit. The family unit, the mom, the dad, and the kids are the domestic church. And traditionally, the Catholic Church has been composed of hundreds and hundreds and thousands of domestic churches. So, for example, one difference between how the Catholic Church maintains its attendance versus a Protestant or an evangelical church is the church down the street from me, the Catholic Church has 2,000 families, okay? Whereas an evangelical church will typically say, hey, we have 2,000 people. That doesn't mean families, that means people. Whereas the Catholic Church, we're talking maybe 5,000 to 10,000 people within that parish because it's a family unit, not just a single person. This is the domestic church. Each Catholic church is a collective unit of hundreds of domestic churches. So, that said, I want you to go back about 175 or 200 years to the mid-1800s. Okay, the mid-1800s is a unique time because it is prior to the Industrial Revolution. And prior to the Industrial Revolution, there are three major components in the upbringing of a child. Okay, number one, just the simple education of a child. Number two, the trade of a child, like when they grow up, what are they going to become? And number three is the faith of a child. So all three of these major components of a child in bringing them to fruition as an adult were traditionally done in the home. In the home. I mean, think about this. In the 1850s, for the most part, you have trades which are small entrepreneurial trades which are done by the father, or they are farming units, whether they are a cobbler or a mechanic or a grocer or a milkman, whatever they might be. These are usually smaller trades that are done by the dad, and they sustain the family. And typically when a boy grows up in a home, he will learn the trade from the father. And in the same way, the mom will train the daughters how to upbring the house, how to bring up the home. And all of the responsibilities that included. I mean, we're not at all limiting the husbands from the mothers. They were a family unit which was responsible for everything that the family brought in. Okay, so the trade of a person, for the most part, is learned in the home. The parents are the primary responsible agents for that. Secondly, also, the education of the kids were predominantly taught by the parents. Now, did public school exist during this time? Yes, it did. But it wasn't massive. It wasn't federally funded. It even wasn't state funded. For the most part, public schools were, they were open to the public, but families still had to pay for the education of their children. Like a one-room school, for example, wasn't just free. They had to pay the teacher with these other families to educate their children. So, in many respects, public education was done stereotypically in the home until a certain age in which you either went on and became your trade, you did your trade, or you went on to perhaps the university education where you needed to learn for law or for medicine or for priesthood. So that was the second thing. So the first was trade. The second is education. The third is catechesis. Catechesis, for the most part, again, was learned in the home. It was the parents' primary responsibility to raise the child, to learn the faith, and to live out the faith. And the parish was actually responsible just for the sacraments. The parent was responsible for everything else. The parish was responsible for the sacraments. So this is prior to the 1870s, 1880s. Now, once we get into the Industrial Revolution, which really between 1875 to 1910, let's just call it that, The Industrial Revolution began to change things. What happened during the Industrial Revolution? Well, number one, we have an influx of immigrants coming in from Europe. Irish immigrants, Italian immigrants, French immigrants, German immigrants. My own family was German immigrants that moved to Cawker City, Kansas in the late 1800s, okay? And all of these immigrants, for the most part, are Catholic. And they're coming into America. They're predominantly residing in the metropolitan areas. And while they're residing in the metropolitan areas, because of the poverty of the situation, both immigrant parents, are beginning to have to work, which was kind of an anomaly at the time, where you're working in the factory, not in the home. Okay, this is the rise of the Industrial Revolution. And because parents are working in the factory separate from the home, you now have to worry about what the kids are doing when the parents are gone. And so really, during the late 1800s and the early 1900s, you see the rise of the parochial Catholic school system. The parochial Catholic school system was a response to the Industrial Revolution and to the rise of immigrants in America. All right. Yes, did it exist before that? Yes, of course. But the popularity of it, the major increase of it, came as a response to the Industrial Revolution. Secondly, we also see the rise of public education. By 1918, the federal government required that all states have a publicly funded education system. Prior to that, really between 1900 and 1918, we see the rise and the escalation of this. Prior to that, it wasn't necessarily mandatory in all of the states. And so, again, prior to 1900, most of the education was responsible, parents were responsible for this. All right, so how does this change? Why is this important? You can begin to see why it's important, because today, what was once the responsibility of parents has now been outsourced to major institutions. Let me repeat that. What was once the responsibility of parents, in other words, when you got married and when you entered into a family, when you started having kids, you intuitively assumed that your responsibility as parents was to raise up the child to learn, to read, to write, to do math. Secondly, you were to raise them up in the faith, that they might have a knowledgeable and adequate knowledge of what they believed. And thirdly, that they might have an adequate knowledge of how to live successfully as a human being in work. This was the primary responsibility of the adult. Now, all three of those have been outsourced to different institutions. The public school is responsible for education, or the parochial school. Secondly, for trade, it's usually up to the university now, or in the other case, the trade industries, the unions that educate them. Or thirdly, interestingly, we have outsourced the responsibility of raising our kids in the faith to the church, okay? The church has never been responsible, so to speak, for actually catechizing the child to live their faith. It has always been the role of the parent, okay? But now we have outsourced that to the church. That sounds weird, but I'll explain a little bit more about that. Okay, so we have another development as well that is interesting. Really, prior to the 1900s, prior to the Industrial Revolution, what we get is we have a predominantly theological understanding of God and our existence. Okay, we exist for the purpose of God. God created us. God is the creator of the world. He has saved us. We have a relationship with Him. Our purpose in life is to unite with Him. Our ethics in life are to follow what He has said is good. All of these things. Well, post-1880s, post-1890s, Darwin comes out in 1870-something, we begin to see a rise in secularization. What is secularization? Secularization is just this mindset that God is a figment of our imagination. He's just a social construct that we make so that we can have order in society and meaning in life, but really meaning falls way outside of that. Secularization kind of is this premise that we are just simply material beings. There's nothing spiritual beyond this world. When we die, we're just going to go back into the earth, and there's no eternal perspective, okay? We are creatures of the world. We are material beings. We are not eternal. And with this rise of atheism, we have predominantly seen that the society has lived completely void of God. So on top of this, you have the deconstruction of the family. The deconstruction of the family, contraception. I'm just going to mention this really briefly. So contraception and the lack of children, replacement rate in America is 1.7. In order to fully replace the economy, you have to have a replacement rate of 2.1. In Europe, that's worse. It's like 1.3 in Italy, which I think in the next 30 or 40 years is projected that 10 or 15 million jobs in Italy are not going to be there. And this is significant because the population of Italy is only like 60 million, so that's crazy. Divorce rate has increased. Children born with two parents has decreased. Both parents go to work, just like in the Industrial Revolution, and this has begun to change things. Now, how has this begun to change things? So I've already mentioned that the domestic church, the family unit, used to pass on the faith. The first generation would pass it on to the second generation, which would pass it on to the third generation. And this was how the faith was passed on. However, what we begin to see now is that the first generation has maybe passed on to the second generation, and as the second generation has had kids, what they've done as the parish has increased its responsibility of catechesis because of the way of culture, the parents have really by default given their kids to the parish, and they've said to the parish, you're the ones who are responsible for raising my kids up to be faithful. Okay? I'm essentially just a manager of my kids. I'm not the intricate teacher. I'm not the intricate faith former. I'm not the intricate pastor that's really into the nitty-gritty of my kids. I'm just the one that manages their time, and I'm telling them to go to church, and then they learn it at the church. So our kids now are basically as good as the catechesis that they receive at church, whether that's through the parochial school system or whether that's through the Wednesday night, School of Religion or CCD or whatever you call it. All right. This is not the way it was ever designed to be, but this is the case that we have now. And so what you have is that this parish was supposed to be just a unit with lots and lots of domestic churches. It was a group of lots and lots of domestic churches. Now the parish responsibilities have swelled, and they've encompassed the role of what the domestic church has taken on, and it's just this overwhelming task that the pastor and the priest and all of the lay workers who are paid at the church have taken on for themselves. So, what is the result? Well, an increasingly declining belief and involvement in the ideas of the institutional church has led the parish to take on more than what it was ever intended to take on. And here's the problem, here's the conundrum of this. Anytime in society that the shaping of our next generation is neglected by parents, we can be sure that within a couple of generations, we will witness a flailing faith. Okay? Let me say that again. Any time that the primary responsibility of the parents is stripped from them or is given up, in our case, we can be sure that within 1 or 2 generations, the faith of our future will be faltering. The faith and practice of parents are single-handedly the most important influencer on children. This has always been the case, and this will always be the case now and in the future. So what's the reality? We can look at these statistics and we can see since the Industrial Revolution, there has been a drastic decline in the Catholic faith, so that now the numbers are this. 100 million people baptized as Catholics in the U.S. Of those 100 million people, 40 million have left the Catholic Church. Of those, 30 million of the 100 million, 30 million attend Mass on Christmas and Easter only, okay? So of the 100 million baptized, 70 million are gone. 70 million Catholics are gone. Of the 30 million that are left, 15 million attend Mass but not regularly, and the 15 million that are left attend Mass regularly each Sunday. So 15% of Catholics who are baptized Catholic are actually attending Mass regularly, which means that there has been a large exodus in the church, and I think predominantly that lies within the fault of not just the church and all the institutional garbage that has happened in the last 30 years or 60 years really, but it also lies in the fault of the parents who have not seen it as their primary responsibility to raise kids in the faith. All right? So we have to begin to change this trend. And how do we begin to change this trend? Really, I think there's 3 things, and I'm not going to go into each of those. I'm just going to introduce them. Number 1, we have to begin to put the emphasis of mission back on the layperson. Here's what I mean by that, okay? We have kind of defaulted to, oh, it's the church's responsibility to evangelize. It's the pastor's responsibility to be a good homilist. It's the church's responsibilities to provide really good dynamic programs so that people will flock to the church. And this is actually the antithesis of what the Catholic Church has been for 2,000 years. It hasn't been come to the church building. It has actually been, no. The lay people go out to their neighborhoods in the domestic church. They are the domestic church, and where their homes are, they do the work. It's kind of the idea of this. If you have a huge McDonald's, okay, the way to get bigger, the way to get more people into the McDonald's is not to create a bigger McDonald's so that people can flock to that McDonald's from further and further out. The way to create more viewers or more eaters at the restaurant is to franchise. You make lots and lots of other McDonald's so that people all over the world can start enjoying McDonald's. Okay, this is the same exact concept of the church. You have a parish hub, but then you also have domestic churches that go out to the neighborhoods, and they are the missional influence. So we have to, number 1, begin to put the emphasis of missional responsibility back on the layperson. Number 2, we have to set up a model where people can experience what meaningful conversation looks like. Why do I say this? Okay, Deuteronomy chapter 6. After the 10 commandments are said, Moses tells these people. He says this, Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 6. He says, "These commandments that I give you today are to be upon your hearts. Impress them on your children." How do you impress them on your children? By doing this. Talk about them. When you sit at home, and when you walk along the road, when you lie down, and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the doorframes of your houses and on your gates. In other words, at every single opportunity that we have as parents, we should be talking about our faith. We should be talking about Scripture. We should be talking about the Mass. We should be talking about prayer. We should be talking about prayer requests. We should be talking about the first things in life, the more meaningful things. This is how our kids begin to understand what is important to us. When we talk about Chiefs football and Royals baseball and sporting, KC sporting, and all other types of things, sports, when we talk about dance and drama and movies and whatever it is that's important to us, and we never ever talk about faith, our children intuitively learn what is important to us. And guess what? It's not faith. The only way to make faith important, and the only way for our children to catch the faith and to see that it's important, is if we have meaningful conversation about our faith. And that meaningful conversation needs to happen in a myriad of different ways and occasions and etc. And the last issue is we need to relocate the primary place where faith is passed on. This is not the parish center. This is the home. Parents, during the coronavirus, I urge you to take up the opportunity to make your home the place where your kids learn about their faith. Peace.